Military parents never miss a beat, and neither does the Johns Hopkins U.S. Family Health Plan. Built for every warrior in your family, with more than 40 years of service to military families. TRICARE Prime benefits plus exclusive extras. Learn more at warriorsathome.com.
Hello and welcome to Yeah, We Read It. This is a very special episode for us. I'm one of your hosts, Maggie.
And I'm also one of your hosts, and my name is Laura.
And we are going to be covering a one-off book, A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid.
That comes out this September. This is a sneak peek review look into the book.
Yes, and this was a really good book.
I had so much fun.
Oh my gosh, it was such a blast.
It was honestly, I'll say what we're all thinking. I had too much fun.
Yeah. I really like spooky books, and
right?
as we get into autumn, I love spooky season, and I would say that this is one of the more haunting. Like, this felt like a very haunting book.
No, like there was such a good like eeriness to it, but it was still so like lighthearted and digestible without like. I like when things are spooky, but they're not going to give me nightmares. And that's what I really enjoyed about this book. Like, lots of parts were chilling and edge of my seating, but they weren't going to completely ruin my day, you know?
Yeah. I will say, I feel like this one gave me a few. I got scared sometimes at night.
Some things I was like, what the frick is going on? But I was never scared at night, but I also read this like broad daylight all the time. I never really read this at night. So maybe that was my pro.
I read most of this on a plane, and I think it was like the white noise energy.
The whooshing of the plane while you were reading this, I think would be terrifying.
Yeah, it's like you're in a sensory deprivation tank, and then I was also reading this, and then I like landed at night at midnight, and I was like, time to go to bed, which was hard. But a lot of alluding to the book, essentially A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid. I think it is their second book.
It's their third book.
Their third. Wow, good for them. They wrote The Wolf and the Woodsman and Juniper and Thorn, if you are familiar with that. But A Study in Drowning.
And this is their first YA book, which is so cool.
That's great. It was a wonderful book. It follows the story of a young architecture student and a scholar, sort of a enemies to lovers.
Should we just dive in, Meg? Should we not just get ahead of ourselves? Should we just dive in?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
we can dive right in.
Do you want to do quick synopsis and then big synopsis? What do you feel?
Oh yeah, so essentially it's just a woman who is in architecture, and she goes to a haunted mansion, kind of. But Eddie Murphy is not there,
which is an interesting fan fiction idea for this series.
Effy running into
let's
Eddie
dive
Murphy,
in.
yeah.
So we have our because also we should say we're interviewing the author of this episode, so we have to get through our book discussion quickly so we can get to the real tea with Ava. So first, let's talk about this. Effy Sater, she is our main protagonist. She's an architect student. She is like the only girl student at the architecture school. She doesn't really like architecture. She really wants to study literature, but she's not allowed. There's this book is set in like a time period where women are clearly less than males. And she ends up designing a poster and winning a contest to design Highright Manor, which is like the old mansion of one of her favorite authors, Mirden. So she's going to get shipped off to go basically redesign his mansion for his widow and his son.
Yes, so she is headed to the southern region. She is a northern girl, which it seems like there is a bit of difference there in the fact that like the southern region is very spiritual. She heads to Saltney, which is a part of the Bottom 100 in the Bay of Nine Bells.
Yes.
It's kind of a weird, eerie place, like known for its magical realm.
Spooky, yeah.
It is.
He is not in the city anymore.
And when she gets there, the person who's supposed to pick her up isn't there. She gets stressed. She calls her mom. We learn that her mom's necessarily not the most comforting person.
No.
And on the way up to this cliffside manor, she sees something in the dark that she describes as the Fairy King, who is the protagonist of the book that Mirrodin had written that she is obsessed with, and he vanishes in a flash. So she is
Yeah.
like on edge about this
Yeah.
architect project.
And we also know that Effy does suffer from mental illness and has to take, I think, pink pills during the day if she's feeling too like anxious or stressed, and blue pills at night to help her fall asleep so she doesn't have nightmares about the Fairy King. The next morning, a boy wakes her up. He's
Oh.
about her age. His name is Preston. And he leads her from her guest house to the main house. And he also saves her from falling down a cliff, because I don't think there's enough words for us to describe that this like house is on like a cliff in all senses of the word and all extreme senses of that word.
And this cliff is like this, the whole place is susceptible to being a part of the second drowning. The first drowning completely wiped out the southern region,
Yeah.
and that's an added element that is really stressful. But her and Preston don't necessarily hit it off. She figures out very quickly that he is the person who checked out all of these books on Mirrodin, and she was a little bit mad about that because she wanted to read them. So she starts off not necessarily liking him.
Yeah, because his whole thing is he's there to basically write a thesis about Mirrodin's life, but he's such a by the books and by the facts guy. So he's not even reading these books for fun. He's reading them to like write about them and write theory on them and rhetoric, and she is not about that life.
Yeah, her job there seems a lot harder than his, because as Ianto, the son of Mirrodin, is showing her around the house, it is in horrid condition.
Like, I'm surprised as we were going through this house that it was still standing. The basement is submerged in water.
I don't get that.
Like
How? Like,
how? And that's what I think I love most about this book, that there's these fantastical details that seem so out of this world but just exist in truth in this book, and that we have no choice but to be like, yep, this is the reality. This basement is basically a below ground swimming pool through no fault of its own.
So she is like, I don't know if I can do it. I need to walk back to town. I need to call my mom. She is in this space where she's like, I don't even know if I can go back to school. Like, her advisor had like, it's implied that he assaulted her, and she just doesn't really want that reputation because there is one going around, not of her own volition at school, which really sucks.
Yeah.
So she's walking, and Preston sees her and is like, I like to work at the bar anyways, so I will pick you up and go. And along the way, she runs into a guy who gives her a stone to keep watch out for the Fairy King if she ever runs into him again.
And it's this man who is herding like a bunch of sheep or goats. I forget exactly which one it was. And she's obviously a little put off by this, I imagine, because it's a little weird to have somebody with a bunch of animals just approach you and just hand you a bunch of rocks and be like, hey, this will help you in the event that the Fairy King comes. But she's going to pocket those like we all would, because it is very important to protect yourself from the Fairy King.
Yeah, and we don't know if like Ianto, anything about him yet really is bad, but he gives off bad vibes the next day because he's showing her around, he's showing her the floor plans. This house is busted, buddy. And when he lays his hands on her shoulders, she just feels like a really uncomfortable weight. She wants to tell Preston. She goes to his room to tell him. She doesn't, and she notices that he is working on a thesis, essentially discrediting Mirrodin for not being the author of his own work.
And Effy is mad because like Effy loves Mirrodin. Like, it is her favorite author. And Preston essentially asks Effy to help her because she clearly cares so much about his works. And he does need someone to kind of counterbalance all of his, harsh criticisms with the actual person who enjoys his books and has like the kind of writer creativity side to his very scientific way of writing.
So the get is if she decides to co-author this with him, she will get co-authoring credit, something completely unheard of, like we said, for women. They don't get to get into literature school. And then maybe she can also lobby it as her ticket into the lit school, which is great.
And something interesting that she finds while she is snooping around all of his notes is that he's written her name a bunch of times in the margins, and she doesn't say anything, but she's definitely thinking about that.
Don't know why he didn't think through that one, because like I snoop. I feel like anyone would snoop.
Buddy, this house is
Especially
falling apart. It is going to be so easy to get into that study to find what is going on in there, you know?
Come on, Preston, use your brain. So they decide their idea walking away from this is that she is going to get the blueprints to the house to see if there is any discrepancies, anything missing, anything she should know about. So she goes to Ianto the next day, and Ianto is like, you know what? Let's carry this conversation on at the bar. And at the bar, he is laying it on thick, being weird, saying she's cute, gives her the blueprints, and then is like, we need to go. He's angry all of a sudden.
Yeah, he is being creepo McDeepo. We do not like his vibe here. It is bad, and it turns really scary because he starts like speeding up this cliff, and he starts talking about like things like not all girls are grateful for chivalry, and he's being very, very intense. And in this moment, she sees in Ianto the Fairy King, and she hurls herself out of this car and ends up walking home after the fact. And Preston ends up finding her being like, what happened? Ianto locked himself in his bedroom. Why are you bleeding?
It's a night to remember. Preston's cleaning up her sores that are bleeding on the carpet now. They notice in the blueprints that there is something weird about Ianto's room. There is empty space in the floor plans that wasn't accounted for. That's kind of behind a wall. So they are going to check that out. But on the way back to her room, she notices a ghost that looks like a woman in a white dress, and she's like, I gotta take my pills. Gotta remember.
Yeah, and Effy's also like, also maybe something's very wrong with High Ryth Manor. Maybe. Next morning, she's like, I'm on it. She takes 2 of her pills. She runs to the manor, and Preston gives her his coffee because he's a good guy. And they decide to go investigate this whole mysterious closet while Ianto's at church. And it's very like on edge. I didn't realize how like nerve-wracking I was gonna feel as they were going through this, because they're like, he's only gonna be away for an hour and we have to get into this closet.
That's not that much time.
Yeah, and they end up finding a like chained up box in there, and Effy, no chill, just hurls it at the wall to get it open.
That was really funny.
And Preston's like, what are you doing? And it works though, so it gets open, and they find a journal and some sexy photographs in there. And so they're like, whoa. This wasn't what we were expecting.
Pretty sure it was also a blonde girl with green eyes, like the protagonist.
Maggie, are you saying you want to be the girl in the photos?
Depends on how hot she looks in the photos, because it could be me. I don't know. So they find these photos. They find the diary, and the diary kind of details encounters that Mirrodin had with one woman who seemed to be like the protagonist, the basis for the character in Angard. They do see a fellow poet's name, Colin Blackmar, and they're like, maybe that's our next step, is reaching out to this friend. Maybe he authored it. So that is their idea, is their next plan is going to him to see what's up.
Not before this happens, because they're obviously looking over this in the study, and Ianto shows up holding a fucking gun, which was insane. That was terrifying. And he is mad that Preston and Effy are getting closer, and he's being very creepy, and he's like, I wouldn't want either of you exploiting my generosity. And we're like, whoa, buddy, put the gun down.
Yeah.
And then
so they need a game plan.
Yeah, so they need a game plan. Next day, they're both a little jumpy, and they end up convincing Ianto to let both of them go on like a trip to the library to get a book, even though they're going to go visit Blackmar instead.
Yes. So the whole idea of this is Effy is going to be going to the library. Preston is going to be going to Blackmar's. They get in the car. They lied. They lied to their elders. They're going together. And they go to stay with Blackmar for a bit so they can study Angard.
I read it as like Angard or Angarat. It's his most famous works. That it's Effie's favorite book, if we haven't said that.
Yeah. And when they get there, they try to kind of crack Blackmar up, but he won't open. He is closed off about talking about his daughter. who is the woman that they think was in the photos and the book, but his publisher is going to be there tomorrow, so they're like, maybe we can ask him.
Yeah, and they're gonna stay at his house, which is super nice of him to let them stay there. Effie finds a scroll under the bed in the guest room she is staying at. Preston has to wear like all of Blackmar's clothes while they're staying there, and it always ends up being too short, which is very, very funny. But Effie thinks it's kind of sexy, so
Effie does. And on top of this, Preston had to sleep in her bed platonically the night before because she forgot her pink pills, so she can't go to sleep throughout the night.
Oops. Sounds like these enemies are getting a little bit closer, if you know what I mean.
They have to speed away from the ball the next day. The publisher, in asking and answering their questions, doesn't really give them anything. They figure out he's the son of the original publisher.
Yeah.
So they're like, all right, we're walking away from this with the understanding that at least Mirrodin was in correspondence with Blackmar's daughter from the letters that we found under her bed.
Yeah, and this is where Effie really has this moment of like realizing that like her hero is not who she thought he was. And Preston pulls over and they talk about their kind of heroes failing them, and we learn a lot about Preston's dad, who died from a traumatic brain injury that he got in a car wreck. And
it was like his brain was slowly flooding.
Yeah. And so it's this really like good moment where I think they both are very vulnerable with each other and they get a lot closer together. And I really wanted them to kind of kiss in this moment, but I guess it's kind of weird to like want people to kiss over sharing their trauma. So I get why it didn't happen, but I was rooting for them so much.
Because is this when Effie opens up about her mom too?
That was earlier.
Oh, that was earlier. Okay.
Yeah, but it's okay. Read the book and get there. It's great. We're only giving you the highlights.
We're only giving you the highlights. So they get back. They figured out they need to get the documents from the basement. And Preston is like, it's flooded. And as we know, flooding stresses him out.
Yeah, and there's also a big storm coming, so it's gonna like flood even harder.
Yes, they have a heated moment where Effie kind of like sits on Preston and indicates that they are gonna hook up, but he is like, "Listen, I know about you and your advisor, and I don't want to take advantage of you in that way."
Yeah. But he does indicate he's like, I want to, but I don't want you to think that I'm taking advantage of you, and I want to do this in like a good way.
Yeah,
we love a consensual king. We love it.
Love when consensual king, and also when there's literally no time because they have to get the documents. There's no time for awkwardness.
They have 2 days to get out. They don't have time to hook up right now because it is starting to rain. Effie is walking to the house. She sees the fairy king and she runs, and she finds Ianto staking down the trees. Because like otherwise they'll fall on the infrastructure of the house. And she ends up kind of helping him get his jacket so she can steal the key to the basement and go for a swim down there. She ends up getting it. And they basically both are like, it's now or never. We have to get these blueprints and get everything from the basement and run because we cannot come back here. This house is not going to survive this storm.
Yes, because when she dived into the basement, she found a box that said Engard on it, which we assume is the original book. So after she has dived, she is really cold. They go to the guest house. She wants Preston to stay. They have sex. We know what happens there.
Yeah, they do.
They've overslept. They really gotta go.
I was so happy for them, but then it was like, y'all are on a timeline. And it's storm time. Effie is awoken. She says, the storm is here. We gotta go. And the winds are winding, and they need to get up to the house and get the letters and the pictures. But the house is in awful shape. The staking of the trees did nothing to protect the house because it is creaking and tilting and whooshing and rushing all inside of these elements. And Ianto's waiting for them once again with his gun. And we gotta put the gun away, buddy. It's not a good look.
We gotta Second Amendment we gotta kill your idols, kill the Second Amendment. So kill your idol, the gun. He's sitting there with his gun. He is like, you guys have taken advantage of my kindness. You know what? If the house is going to survive, it needs the sacrifice of a fatherless child. And that's you, Preston. So let's go, buddy. So he shackles him to the basement wall as it's flooding and just kind of leaves him there. And then
Like,
Effie hits her head and knocks herself out.
literally just like Madman City, because not only did they just walk into this guy's house who's holding a gun, but he's like, by the way, I'm going to chain you into the basement that's going to flood, and that's going to save my house.
I've had worse Mondays.
Haven't we all, folks? But not looking good, because obviously Preston's gonna die down there. And Ianto, like Maggie said, has smashed Effie's head into the wall. And he's like, no, Effie, I'm not going to kill you. And now in this moment, the house is slanting towards the sea. So this isn't good for everything. And he in his madman moment is going to say, no, Effie, while your boyfriend is dying, you have to finish the blueprints for the house. And you are going to be
Turn your
here
homework
with
in.
me.
Yeah.
And
he becomes completely the Fairy King. He's completely taken. The Fairy King, Ianto, is basically gone. Fairy King is taken over, and it's revealed that like she was essentially left to die by her mom. The Fairy King took her finger, her ring finger, so she could have no other guys. So no time for Preston. Sorry.
Yeah.
And in the falling of the house, the chandelier kind of shatters, and when she kneels to him, because she's like, "Sure, I'll kneel to you," she grabs a piece of broken glass and reflects his image back to himself, which it is alluded throughout the book that the Fairy King does not want to see his image, and he kind of like melts.
He melts into a man and then turns to dust. The imagery of it is so cool. But we do not have time. Effie does not have time to think about how cool the imagery was of slaying the Fairy King, because her boyfriend is once again drowning in the basement. And Preston is still alive, but the water is rushing and gushing. It is hard to get those chains out of the wall. Yeah. She does consider leaving him, which I do not love, but then she decides, I'm going to try one more time.
Yep.
And then someone's helping her get the chain off of the wall.
She thinks it's the ghost from earlier, but no, it turns out to be Angathard, the woman of the story.
Yeah, and it turns out it wasn't actually a ghost. It was Mirrodin's widow, who
just
is
an old woman.
Who's just a really old woman, which, like, ouch. Effie, that was mean. That was like mean, but we'll allow it.
It's like when someone guesses your age and it's so old that you're just a ghost.
How old are you, Spectre? Or Phantom?
So they steal away all of them to the guest house. They're very tired. Angard tells her story, which kind of boils down to she wrote the book and Mirrodin took it. Her dad and him had a bit of a deal, which was her dad kind of felt disgraced by her and was like, okay, you can publish the book and also have my daughter. I just kind of want her out of my house.
Yeah, like he was so disgraced that she would be bedded before marriage or whatever during this affair that he basically like gave her to Mirrodin. Yeah. And they signed a deal that basically Mirrodin would take her book and then her dad would get all of the profits from it, which is like such a low blow. And we also learn that Mirrodin, she didn't realize this when she was young, had the Fairy King inside him all along. Like Fairy King used Mirrodin as a vessel. And as they aged, it took him over more and more and more. And then once he passed away, the Fairy King needed a new vessel. So it basically infiltrated her son. So she's had like a really, really rough past couple of decades is what I'm hearing.
She's lost 2 boys to Tinkerbell. Kind of sucks.
Yeah. Not a big fan of that. But they basically open the box. They're kind of bummed because they lost all like the letters in the house, but everything in the box is not like a manuscript of the book. It's more letters. It's her diary and other things that prove that she actually wrote the book. So their thesis is going to be
solid.
Piping hot.
And it seems that Angard is also going to come clean and she's like, you know what? What's bad press to a life of being locked up in this shitty manner. Yeah. So she doesn't really care. She's going to come clean. They go back to college together. Preston earlier on promised Effie that he will take care of her, which was very sweet.
Very sweet. I like them.
they kind of argue with the dean on the fact that she is going to take partial credit. She's going to co-author this. She's also going to be the first woman in the literature school. And also she's like, you know what? Get my mentor fired. He assaulted me.
Get it, Effy. I was so glad that she was like, no, we do not let men get away with their shitty behavior.
Loved it. So it wraps up on Preston meets her friends at a party they throw for her. Everything's kind of going back to normal. And throughout the book, Preston admits that he does not really believe in the supernatural, but he does mention that he could hear bells ringing his whole time being in the bottom 100, which alludes to the Bay of Nine Bells, which are the churches that drowned.
Yeah.
In the first drowning.
Yeah. So kind of feels like Preston's coming around to a little bit of magic.
And I guess the magic is that women get equal rights.
And the magic was also that everybody should read this book because it was a fun read.
It was, oh my god, this was such a great read. I hope that it gets all of the accolades, all of its flowers when it comes out in September.
I cannot wait. And I also can't wait because it wouldn't be a Meggie and Laura Yeah, We Read It episode if we didn't do our top 5.
Absolutely. And for our top 5, since this is such a supernatural, such a wonderfully fleshed out world, we are going to do the top 5.
It's a wonderfully fleshed out world, and we're just gonna put our little spin on things.
We're gonna flesh it out more with the top 5 creatures that we think also live in this world.
Yep, exactly. This is other creatures we would like to exist in this fantasy world that Ava Reid spent so much time lovingly creating, and Meggie and I just want to have some fun now.
So, coming in at number 5, we are believing that werewolves live in this world. Let's start off easy. Werewolves.
I mean, Fairy King was like slicked back Harry. Werewolves are also slick back Harry. Something else is a twofer. We've got goblins and ghouls. That's got to be very present in this environment. I also love to think that they all wear clogs.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think they wear the wooden shoes that curl up at the toes.
Exactly. They wear wooden clogs and they dance. They dance at night.
So a little bit Keebler elf, a little bit goblin and ghoul.
Yeah, but less cookies and more dancing.
Coming in at number 3, Laura proposed this, and it seems like since there's going to be another flooding, it's his world and we're just living in it. Number 3, the Loch Ness Monster.
Wow, that is so deep. It's just his world and we're living in it. Snaps for that. That was like a slam poem in my little eardrum. Number 2, Meggie said this one as a joke, and I said, no, we're gonna put that in there. X-Men crossover.
Yep.
What's a little fantasy without a little sci-fi? They're very close, a little Venn diagram, if you will. A little collab. We love a collab Central City. Get some Wolverine, get some Storm.
Exactly.
Get some Professor X. Those are, I think, are the only 3 X-Men I can name off the top of my head right now.
I know Magneto's also in there.
Oh, yeah. That's another one.
He's a guy, too. And number 1, we both kind of ping-pong back and forth on this brilliant idea.
Yeah.
But we would love that glow-in-the-dark nuns also live in this world.
And you might be wondering, wait, Meggie and Laura, glow-in-the-dark nuns, how does that fit into fantasy lore? And we argue that fantasy lore can be whatever you want it to be. And we also said that maybe these nuns are magical, or maybe they just carry around magic 8 balls. And that is up to the reader to decide.
The beautiful thing about nuns is they could be everywhere and everything.
And most of all, that they glow in the dark and that they are nuns.
And that is going to be our wrap-up for A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid. Stick with us as we have our interview with Ava up next.
All right. And previously on this episode, you listened to us talk about A Study in Drowning as a whole book synopsis. And now we're going to talk about it with the author of that book, Ava Reid. Ava, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, of course. Very excited to be here.
Yeah, well, we're excited to have you. Thank you. Like we probably mentioned earlier, Study in Drowning was really good, really fast read, different than a lot of young adult novels we read. And I feel like how fluent and very prosy it was.
Yeah.
Like, I think we've read supernatural books in the past, but this one blew a lot of them out of the water, I will say.
Thank you.
Yeah. No pun intended because of all the water in the book.
I appreciate the unintentional pun.
So I guess before we get deeper and deeper and deeper into all of the questions that we have just about the book in general, I want to start talking about you as a writer. So I want to start talking about, how did the idea for A Study in Drowning come about?
Yeah, so it actually started in kind of an obscure place, which is the Shakespeare authorship question. It's kind of this, it's referred to as anti-Stratfordian theory, and it's kind of like a group of different theories that basically believe that Shakespeare was not the author of the works that are attributed to him, and maybe he didn't even exist at all, and different theories propose different alternative authors. And obviously this is pretty much completely discredited today, but historically, like, it was actually taken very seriously by a lot of, you know, historians and public intellectuals, and people were really like dedicated to this idea, to the point where like they would dig up graves to like try and look for clues. Like, it was this big mystery.
Oh, wow.
They created like cipher machines to like go through his work, to try and see if there's like some secret code to the author's true identity. So I just became so interested in like that question of authorship, and like, what would it mean if we found out that an author as important as Shakespeare was not actually, like, did not actually write his works, and maybe wasn't even a real person. Like, that would be kind of devastating in a lot of ways. I mean, it would certainly be devastating to like all the scholars of Shakespeare. But I think like his cultural impact is so enormous that it would have, I don't know, it would do a lot. It would change a lot about society, and particularly like kind of Western identity, because he's so wrapped up in like, you know, Western literature, Western culture. Sorry, that was very long-winded, but that was kind of where like the idea came from, was like taking apart, you know, and grappling with the idea of like, what happens when a famous author is not the author.
Yeah, exposed as fraud. No, that's such a cool, like, obviously I've heard about that like Shakespeare like theory before, so knowing that it just came from that, and that little like tidbit of conspiracy kind of inspired this whole book is so cool.
Yeah, and also I think that that's like obviously a common theme in A Study in Drowning, I would argue, is that like a little bit of that like kill your idols idea, where Effy is kind of reconciling with one of her favorite authors not having like a work of art like be kind of like, you know, I don't want to like ruin it, but accurate or like truthful to them. And I think that that's like really prevalent today in society, of like separating the art from the artist. So I'm kind of curious like what your thoughts are in terms of like separating art from artist, and like how you apply that logic to life.
It's a really difficult question, because I think there are so many issues just wrapped up in that question today, because more so than ever, I think authors are expected to be personally connected to our work, and to put a lot of emphasis on our identity, and to really tie that to our work. And the reason for that is just because it's good for promotion. You know, publishers encourage that on our end, and readers also enjoy that on their end. And like, I'm not immune to that. You know, I'm like, you know, buying stuff from Otessa Moshfegh's Depop shop so I can get a handwritten note from her. Like, so like, as a person, I'm not immune to that, the appeal of like kind of having that intimacy with your favorite author at all. And I don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing. I think that it's a complicated question, and I'm still personally trying to figure out like my boundaries as an author, and my identity as an author, and how that's different from my identity as a person. And I mean, my kind of personal opinion on, you know, the value of like the author's voice within fiction, and kind of like the validity of a piece of work dependent upon the author's identity, is just that I think fiction, all art kind of exists to provoke interesting questions and strong emotions, and as long as a piece of art is doing that, I think that it's successful to me.
Yeah.
No, that's I totally agree. So going back to your entire list of books, I was a little bit on your website as I was prepping for this interview.
Terrible website.
I enjoyed it.
Listen, websites are hard to maintain. Yeah.
But I know you have 2 other novels, and it said A Study in Drowning was your YA debut. So I guess I wanted to hear about more of how you got into the direction of young adult fiction versus I guess what brought you here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had my 2 adult books, which were part of one contract with Harper Voyager, which is the adult SFF imprint of HarperCollins, and then now A Study in Drowning is with Harper Teen, which is obviously the YA imprint of HarperCollins. And part of the reason why I wrote it is because as YA is because like I had this book idea, but I couldn't write it as an adult novel because I had my other contract that was like preventing me from writing something else at that point. But I also was very interested in just thinking about like the difference between YA and adult fiction, because I think more and more the edges are kind of blurring, and the distinction is maybe becoming less and less clear, I think in large part because of social media and like book talk. So it's really interesting to think about, okay, like why should this book be YA as opposed to just adult, like my previous 2 books? And I was thinking about like, to attack that question from a different angle is like, what can I do with like YA that I like maybe can't do with adult? Like, what are the interesting questions that are going to be, salient for a teenage audience that are maybe not going to be as salient for an adult audience? And kind of looking back at my experience as a teenager, which aren't really that long ago, but it's always kind of like cringe to look back at yourself with the curse/benefit of hindsight. All that to say, it was kind of, I guess a lot of factors went into it, but I've always wanted to write both YA and adult.
It's really interesting too that you said that like YA and fiction, especially with book talk, is becoming like a bit blended, like the lines aren't nearly as blurred. I'm not sure why. I feel like at least when Laura and I were younger, born in the 90s, like reading and young adult was like so big for us because I think it's kind of all we had, and now they have that added element of social media. And I'm pretty sure I've looked up, and I think you're pretty big on book talk. I've watched a few of your TikToks. So I'm curious, like, how that intersection of kids on social media and how that blurring of lines for like young adult fiction, maybe how you think it's like impacting readers, or like how you've had to like shift in a market that really values social media in terms of plus writing,
Yeah. So on the first point, I think that the main thing that I've noticed is just the fact, when I was younger, social media wasn't as prevalent, or at least it wasn't like such a big part of like book buying culture. So I wasn't getting, necessarily access to like seeing these titles and seeing these books, just easily on my phone. So, when I'd walk into the bookstore, which was how I learned about all the books I wanted to read, I would just go, to the YA section because I'm like, oh, I'm a YA, so I'm going to go over there. And now, teenagers are just, scrolling their book talk feed, and they're going to see, adult books, they're going to see YA books, and it's not going to be segregated in the same way. So if a book appeals to them, I think there's very few teenagers that are just going to be like, well, I'm a teenager, so I'm not going to read that. Yeah. So I think that it's changed in that sense. And I don't think that, unfortunately, parents really have the ability to stop their teenagers from reading what they want to read, for better or for worse. And as far as social media as an author, it's unfortunately kind of necessary in this day and age. Even as a traditionally published author. That's yeah. And I think a lot of it ties back to this question of like authorship and identity, because being on social media as an author means that you are inherently personally connected to all of your work, you know.
Yeah.
There's no question, you know, about who I am, and like, you know, everyone who is reading my books like is seeing my face, they've heard my voice. It's, you know, it seems like very intuitive now, but like that wasn't always the case for authors. So I think that it creates much more of that expectation that readers are going to be able to contact authors directly. Like that was not a thing when I was growing up.
Yeah.
And now I'm like reading these DMs of people contacting me directly every single day, again, for better or for worse. I think it's becoming almost impossible to just separate the work from the author just because of the way that social media has developed.
Yeah,
I know. Definitely. It's so wild. Like walking into Barnes and Noble now, do you ever see the section that's like recommended by TikTok for you? I'll always see those roped off in bookstores, and I'm like, interesting. What a world we live in.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And something I want to hear more about is it seems like a lot of your books deal with some sort of fantasy, mythological, gothic elements. So I want to hear more about what inspires you most about that type of or types of genres.
Yeah, so I mean, fantasy was like always my first love. I always talk about, and I think like my Zillennial friends also who are authors like also relate to this, or like we grew up on the Warriors books by Aaron Hunter, which are those books about like cats in like clans. Anyway, it's like this amazing middle grade series that's like Watership Down but with cats. I was obsessed with it. A lot of my friends like my age who are authors now were also obsessed with it. So ever since, you know, I was writing my Warrior Cats fan fiction when I was like 11 years old, it all
that is
on
awesome.
from there. And then gothic fiction, again, I don't even remember what kind of, I think it was when I had to read We've Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. I think it was like 8th grade maybe, or like freshman year of high school English. And I love that book so much, and I especially love the protagonist and like her voice and how incredibly kind of intimate the world and the stakes are. And I got really attracted to that idea of like having a world that feels like a character in and of itself. Having, you know, you usually hear the word like expansive in fiction, like it's a good thing, and I'm like, but what if a book was actually claustrophobic, and like that was just as cool.
Yeah, I going off of Shirley Jackson, because I think that she is a phenomenal author in picking sensory details that really immerse you in the world. And that is what with this book I was just so impressed by, was the fact that like you have, you know, it's named A Study in Drowning, and then all of your sensory details and like your descriptions, you illustrated words in a way that almost felt as if you were like swimming or like drowning in water, I would say. And I was wondering if like you had the thesis of your book first and then the wording was kind of intentional in creating that feeling that you were like making prose that was as fluid as water.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what my process is. I'm like a very much a thematic writer, so like the theme of my book always comes first, like the why as opposed to the what. And that makes it very like intuitive to write, because I kind of always have that theme in mind. So down to, like you said, like even just word choice in a single sentence, I'm always kind of referring back to that central theme in my mind. Like, you know, the kind of like on the ground decisions you make about like how a character is going to act in a certain scene. Like it's very easy for me to write that quite intuitively because I've internalized that theme.
Yeah. What drew you to water specifically as like a motif?
Oh my gosh. Well, I live in California now. I'm from New York. But now I live in California, and you know, I went through Hurricane Sandy when I was living back home, but I think in California, you're kind of forced more than where I grew up to like confront like climate change in a very, very major way. And I just this past year and the past few years that I've lived here, it's been very much at the forefront of my mind. And obviously, you know, that theme is significant in A Study in Drowning as well. Kind of the forces of nature and their kind of reaction to, you know, human interference. I think it's impossible, honestly, to live in this part of the country and to not have, you know, kind of very intimate experience of like climate change and just seeing it progress year after year.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Off of that, so I know we talked a lot about, you know, the kind of feeling of water throughout, and there's so much else in this book. There's an entire romance, and there's a lot of lore, and there's an entire mystery that they're solving throughout. So I want to hear more about the writing process as a whole. So in a book that is just so rich with details and ideas, I want to hear more about, where did you start when it came to the plot? Did you start with the mystery? Did you start with the romance? Or did it kind of start as a bunch of smaller ideas that all kind of grew into bigger things as you were writing?
Yeah, so usually I have these kind of like smaller thoughts that are like spiraling around in my brain, and I'm like looking for the way to connect them all, and like sometimes I'll start and like then I'm not connecting them in the right way, and I need that kind of one piece to link everything together. And like I mentioned, it started with this idea of the Shakespeare authorship question, and at first I wanted to write just a contemporary like dark academia book about that and about kind of college students grappling with that question. But then the more and more I thought about it, I was like, I don't want people to come with like their own preconceived notions of Shakespeare, because I wanted to be able to like kind of build my own kind of author, so people could see maybe more starkly what these questions were, as opposed to coming to it like knowing Shakespeare, having their own personal opinions on Shakespeare. So it's like, okay, I need to create a secondary world of fantasy and also an entire literary canon for a fantasy world, which was a lot, but it was really fun. And that's why I have, you know, those kind of snippets at the opening of each chapter, because I kind of wanted to be able to give the readers a little bit of an idea of like what the literary canon of this world is, like what kind of works exist, what, you know, what are the people of this universe reading.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that combining probably two of my questions, I think that like fantasy, obviously for it to work as a book requires a lot of world building. And I think with the world that you built, you have like a lot of things that mirror a lot of like either socio-political, economic issues, gender inequality. And I wonder if you had like any exercises that really helped you in maybe making a world that mirrors our own, and if it was really cathartic and like almost nice that you could jump into this world that was close to ours but not quite, and escape this one for a little bit.
Yeah, I usually, setting wise, for all my past 3 books, I've always started with kind of a real time and place, and then, you know, taken my own liberties from there. And obviously the setting of A Study in Drowning is very much inspired by mid-century England and Wales. I wanted to kind of set it in a time, and this is something I'm just very interested in doing in my books in particular. I wanted to set it in a time of kind of like cultural upheaval, where like, you know, the roles of women in society were changing like very rapidly. And, you know, there was kind of like this turmoil. Obviously, there's also kind of the war in the backdrop, because I needed, you know, some way to explain why the roles of women are suddenly changing in society. And in the real world, that had a lot to do with World War II. So yeah, I started with kind of that time period, and then I jumped off from there and, you know, brought my own kind of experiences to that. So I went to Barnard College, which is the Women's College of Columbia in New York. And it is one of the oldest women's colleges and one of the few women's colleges that remain today. And it was just a very interesting experience going to a women's college that was part of a larger university, because there was very, very much this attitude at Columbia among the other colleges of the university that like, oh, Barnard is like Barnard girls are like stupid, like Barnard girl was like an insult, like yeah, there was like this whole kind of running joke that like, oh, Barnard girls are only there for like Columbia students to hook up with, like this was such a common like running thing. I was dating this like older Columbia guy when I was a freshman, and like I got so much like his friends were like they didn't like me very much, and yeah, so I mean obviously you can see how some of that experience was brought to a study in drowning, and I think it's obviously in the setting it's magnified because it takes place in, you know, an allegory for the 1950s where these you know, sexism was, you know, maybe even more institutionalized and more in your face. But yeah, it did come from kind of that personal experience.
Definitely. And I want to talk about Effy and Preston, because I think Preston kind of represents like the times changing as far as your male characters go. Obviously, he has his own, you know, prejudice against him being from a different country, but Meggie and I, we love a enemies to lovers sort of romance. So I guess I want to hear more if the plan was to have them always wind up together, or was it going to be maybe they're just friends and they kind of work on this thesis together?
No, they were always gonna end up together.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I love the trope of like breaking the skeptic.
Yeah,
and obviously that's very much Preston's character arc. Like I love any kind of relationship that forces the characters to kind of like break their own deeply held beliefs and their own preconceived notions about the world. And I think that that's something that both Effy and Preston have to do over the course of the relationship. And like that's the most romantic thing like to me, is when you're like, I love you so much I need to reevaluate like my most core beliefs in the world.
I'm gonna shake up how I think about things.
And I think that that's awesome, and I think that you know, that relationship creates so much interesting tension. Like my favorite scenes to write where they're just like having these like esoteric arguments about literature, but they're also like expressing so much about who they are as people. And like Preston thinks that he's so like removed from emotion, and that all his arguments are like only rooted in logic, and you know that's kind of not true, because nobody is really like that. Everyone brings their own preconceived notions to
yeah, and their relationship like obviously works a lot because no matter how at each other's throats occasionally they are, I feel like there was always like a deep level of respect and understanding, and especially in giving Effy a lot of like space to explore her own feelings or like deal with things as they come, I think was like really beautiful to see. I will say personally how I saw the relationship, not sure if you meant it, but sort of an enemies to lovers arc, which I'm obsessed with. I always love books like that, and especially if it's set in an academic world, like even better. So great. So I was wondering if you drew like any inspiration of like from the enemies to lovers trope when you were kind of recreating that dynamic between them.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I've been pitching this book as like academic rivals to lovers, so that was definitely like my intention with writing their relationship, because again, I think that I don't know, like I love writing these kind of scenes, these arguments between them, like these kind of you know, defeat debates. I think they're so interesting. Yeah, so I'm all there for the enemies to lovers, rivals to lovers, best trope.
Awesome.
It's such a fun.
It's just so fun. I'll never get tired. I think of that. You could throw any book or movie in front of me, and they're like, "And there's an enemies to lover plot line," and I'm like, "I'm in. I'm sold. I'm gonna digest all of this, and I'm going to be satiated. It's gonna be fantastic."
Yeah.
I don't think we can fully talk about this book without talking about how a big part of Effy's character and just journey overall is her dealing with and remembering and processing her trauma. And I think it can definitely be easy for especially YA authors, but definitely just authors in general, to use the kind of traumatic events to glamorize things in not great ways. Like, oh, I'm going to use this to deem a character as crazy, or I'm going to use it as some throwaway plot device. So I really, really was so happy to see that in this world where there is a lot of larger than life and fantastical elements, that we have this kind of trauma as a real and relatable piece of Effy as a character. I felt like it was a really great way to ground a lot of what was happening in a study in drowning. And so this is a very long-worded way of me saying that I'd love to hear more about your process of writing a character that is dealing with trauma in such a way that does feel like it is handling it with such care and such truth.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, in some ways, is just a book about mental illness, and then everything is kind of wrapped around that. In a sense, and I think actually the more that I kind of talk about the book and the more that I like write about it, like I realize that more and more. And kind of bringing my own personal experiences into that was obviously, you know, something that helped ground it for me. But I've always you know, and it is kind of like the book that I would have loved to have as a teenager when I was going through things that were very similar to what Effy is going through. I would have loved to, you know, have that sort of protagonist to and you know, I did think a lot about how to kind of portray that for a YA audience, because I've written about this before in Juniper and Thorn, which is my previous book, but that is an adult horror novel, obviously. So, you know, the intention with that book is very different. You know, the kind of the way that you explore the subject matter can be different because it's meant to like obviously evoke horror in people, and that is not the reaction that I wanted it to evoke in A Study in Drowning at all. So yeah, and I was very lucky to be very encouraged by like my agent, my editor, to write about stuff like that, because it's still not necessarily like the easiest sell in a novel, especially in YA fantasy. Like, you know, most people want that kind of stuff and grounded like contemporary books, not as much in fantasy. But so I wanted to kind of play with the element of like mental illness and trauma, almost, you know, transporting you to your own personal fantasy world, because that is kind of what it feels like sometimes. And that is kind of the main way that Effy copes with her.
And I had a question that I just thought of right now, that brought up. So like obviously this book and a lot of your work deals with like heavier things, this one in particular, mental health, assault, and things like that. And like as writers, when we're writing like those heavy topics, we're encouraged to take care of ourselves, and sometimes that can be like really hard to do. So I wonder, you know, like if as a victim writing it, as like things like that, when we put ourselves in that space again, sometimes it can be like so much. So how did you take care of yourself when you were writing about these heavy topics as well?
You know, I've it helps that I've had a lot of like professional treatment over the years, and it's helped that I have read a lot about like trauma theory, so I've gotten to the point where like I can separate myself and, you know, kind of from what I'm writing about, and I can take pieces of my experience and not have it be like, okay, I'm literally transplanting myself onto the page. And I think that that's really helpful, and that's really necessary, because, you know, at the end of the day, I'm writing fiction, I'm not writing a memoir. I think being able to kind of have that distance and that separation, and to, you know, view your own experiences within a larger context of like of psychiatry and trauma theory is super, super helpful. You know, I wouldn't have been able to write this book if I hadn't, you know, been very trauma informed and known a lot about dissociation, you know, psychosis, the things that Effy deals with in the book. I don't think it would have been enough to just write my own like literal experiences onto the page.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, because I mean, like, I found the way that you kind of peppered those moments throughout of like PTSD was just very similar to real life. Like, I mean, I don't know. I feel like the biggest example I can like think of is like when queer people are coming out, they like always expect it to be like one big thing, and it's like the whole idea in our community is like, well, you know, like you come out like over time and things like that. So I was wondering like how you managed to include those moments of like her experiencing triggers or like trauma and things throughout the book without deviating from the whole plot and like stealing focus, since that is what real life is. It's just small moments.
Yeah, that's really true. And I think that in order to do that, it had to be so seamlessly integrated into her character and into the themes of the book. So I could know like instinctually, okay, this is the moment where it's going to come out. And, you know, this is the way that it's going to be expressed. Like, and the same way that you would kind of with any character that you're writing, you would think about it as just as part of them. And, you know, it's not always going to be on the page, but it's still going to be influencing, you know, the things that they do and how they kind of see the world. So just having this, you know, interwoven into her character and into the themes of the book was kind of essential. And it was always a part of the book, you know, since its inception.
Yeah.
Definitely. This is going to be a segue to a lighter question that I have.
Let's do it. Bring it back. Bring it back.
I was like, Maggie and I, we don't want to end this podcast on a downer note of like, let's all talk about trauma and triggers and everything like that.
Let's bring it back. Let's bring it back to fun.
Yeah, let's get we'll heighten the vibes a little bit.
Okay.
One of my favorite visual descriptions in the book was that of the sleeper museums and the glass coffins and how it's a tourist attraction. I was like, this is so fun and so cool. But obviously in the book, that is like their world's 7 most famous authors. So if this was a real place, who would be in your sleeper museum?
Oh my gosh. Well, Shakespeare, obviously.
Yeah.
To be straightforward, then I'm a very big Shakespeare fan. Mary Shelley, I think.
Oh, yeah. Also a good choice.
Nice.
Yeah. Ovid, probably. You have to have, you know, at least a classical author in there. My husband's a classicist, so that's very necessary. Oh my gosh, this is like the most difficult question.
Yeah, and again, I was like, 7's a lot. You don't have to get to all 7. You can just name as many.
You can even do 5.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to say, I'm just like looking around the room at the books that I have.
You're like, where's my bookshelf?
I also like don't want to say anyone alive because that's like kind of spooky. Like,
yeah. That's also valid. I did not think about that when I asked that question.
It's funny.
Yeah. Mervyn Peake, who wrote Gormenghast, that book is really has been really influential to me. He also has like the best name ever. I thought it was a pen name, but that's like his real actual name. If I was named Mervyn Peake, I would have no choice but to become an author of Gothic fiction.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like you literally have to. Yeah, who else? I mean, Shirley Jackson also has been hugely influential to me. It's always like these questions, I feel like every author can relate to this. It's like, we love books so much. All we do is like, we think about books and then someone is like, so like, what's your favorite book? And we're like,
yeah. Or it's one of those that like tomorrow you're going to be like, oh, I should have said that person.
Yeah, of course.
I have those moments all the time. Like, why wasn't I thinking about that then when the time came?
Like when you're in the shower afterwards and you like remember the perfect comeback to the argument, and you're like,
Yeah, exactly. You're like, oh, why was my brain not in that moment there?
I mean, you gave us a solid 5 that we
Yes,
could
exactly.
definitely
That's
run
basically
with.
that's more than enough.
I'm gonna
Yes,
think about
you
this
did
though,
it.
actually.
Email us, get back to
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
So, I'm wondering, like, for any aspiring writers to wanting to like write young adult novel, wanting to write fiction or fantasy, do you have any like tips or tricks or even exercises for either illustrating and drawing out a world, for world building, or for like naming characters and places, since that's such a huge part of building a fantasy book?
Oh my God. It's so funny that you bring that up because my author friends and I constantly talk about how naming things in a fantasy is the worst part of writing. Bar none. Like, that is so true. Like, there have been ideas for me that like have never gotten off the ground just because I couldn't figure out names for like, and not even like people, but like naming like fake countries or like fake.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh,
That
yeah.
is the worst.
I can imagine.
Like, so
Yeah.
for me, I'm really into like kind of linguistics and languages and like
Oh, cool.
dead languages and endangered languages. So that's always something that I like look at when I'm trying to come up with names for things. Like for a book that I'm working on, I was looking at Lombardic kings. They have awesome names. I would really recommend like looking at the Lombardic language is fascinating.
Okay.
Yeah,
Cool. That's
obviously,
cool.
studying drowning, there are a lot of Breton names. Not that Breton is a dead language, but it is a minority language. Breton names are really awesome. Yeah, I wish I had tips because I would use them for myself, but that's like just part of writing is names for things. But for world building in general, I would always say that like kind of one thing that I always think about is the why of the setting. Like, what can this particular setting do for me that another setting couldn't? What is this like contributing to the book? Like, why, you know, even like on a very basic level, like why a city versus, you know, a village? Like, why, you know, why is this in kind of like the medieval era as opposed to like the industrial era? Like, what is that providing to the plot, to the characters, that makes it a necessity? Because I think that in fantasy more so than maybe any other genre, that the setting is where you can get really wild with ideas and it's really fun.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's so cool. And also I feel like encouraging to hear that it's like, yeah, naming things is hard. It's not like it's just like it's kind of just a bone you have, you know?
It's miserable.
That's so funny. And okay, so we're down to our last few questions. So I want to hear, because again on your website, as I was prepping for this, I know you have a 2024 book, Lady Macbeth, coming out. But do you have anything else that's in the works? Any planned returns to the YA world?
Yes, so nothing officially announced on the YA side, but there is another YA book coming. Doesn't have a release date yet because we're still in a nebulous like pre-planning phase, but I will say it is a genre that I've never written before, so very excited to do that. It is kind of a throwback to the, you know, 2010s YA, which is the YA that I grew up with, like Hunger Games.
Yes.
Yeah.
I wanted it to very much feel like of that era. So
yeah,
awesome.
I was like a big name blog in the Hunger Games fandom on Tumblr.
That's so cool.
So those are like my roots. So I'm like getting back to my roots with that book.
What was your username on Tumblr? Because I probably followed you.
I refuse to say, and the reason I refuse to say is because my big thing was that I was like always standing and defending the career tributes, which says so much about me. Like, because I was like,
that's so funny.
Child soldiers, like they are not complicit, but like also they're so morally gray and like complex. Like I was just obsessed with like their whole characterization and like what they're, because we never get very much about what it would have been like to be raised in like a career district. So yeah, that was my whole thing. And so people were always like trying to attack me for like defending murder or whatever.
I mean, you're not wrong. They were conditioned from birth to like be child soldiers.
They were child soldiers. Like this is a
they were. They literally were. That's so funny and also valid. You don't need to go on record with that information.
Yeah, you got us hooked with 2010s YA.
Yeah,
we were all there. We all lived through it.
Yeah, no, I can't wait for that. That is so exciting to me.
That'd be so fun. So I guess wrapping this up, last question would be, where can we keep up with you as an audience on social media or anywhere?
Yeah, not my terrible website, which is terrible and hasn't been updated in so long. But I'm pretty active on Instagram, which is at Ava Reid, all one word, and I unfortunately also do have a TikTok that I use every so often, which is the same handle over there. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ava. We loved reading A Study in Drowning, and we loved getting to talk to you. So thank you for carving out the time to do this with us.
Yeah.
And listeners, you can keep track of Ava everywhere. You just heard Ava say that you can keep track of them. And you can follow us, Meggie and Laura, on Instagram at Meggie_and_Laura, and on Twitter, now presently known as X, at Yeah, We Read It.
Yeah, I guess we got to shout out Elon Musk now too.
Hate that for us.
And that's going to be our episode on A Study in Drowning, I guess.
Yeah.
Any last
so unsure.
I'm not going to wrap up. All right.
Nailed it. Perfect wrap up. Thank you for listening, everyone.